In our first class, we had been trying to pinpoint the definition and scope of comparative literature. And we had also been understood that comparative literature will not simply be comparing the different literatures of different culture or ethnic background, as well as we also understood that every discipline, every new genre, every new perspective in literature will not flourish or will not be accepted in equal value or all the time. So next time, a new approach or discipline will come in literature, and the previous literature will go in less important discipline. That was also understood. And the same situation arises in terms of comparative literature, because after 1960s and 17 decades, the European graduates started to learn other subjects like post-colonial studies, colonial studies, cultural studies, gender studies, film and media studies. Several new disciplines came in existence in Western and European universities. So comparative literature get a less important field, or comparative literature gets less importance in Western and European, as well as in the other countries of Europe, that means in UK and the other parts of, especially the European countries, comparative literature was not accepted as the apex of discipline. So what happened to the other parts of this world towards the comparative literature? Let's see in this class. This field is attracted by India very much. In which way? The work of Indian comparative literature offered a change in attitudes and perspectives. So we have learned that comparative literature will be comparing two literature of two cultures, as well as it will be comparing to one literature or one literature of one language of two different times or two different places. One language but two different places. But Indian comparative literature offered a little bit change in attitude and perspectives. In which way? Let's see. Whenever Western and European graduates were moving on to a new discipline like gender studies and cultural studies, their attitude to comparative literature were being scrutinized and observed from outside. That means outside Europe. In this regard, Majumdar from India tried to define Western literature from geographical perspectives. In which way? Let's see an analogy done by Majumdar. Majumdar put an analogy for defining literature in geographical perspectives. What it is? To Majumdar, Western literature is derived, maximum cases, from Greco-Roman tradition of Christianity. At the same time, English literature is being derived from French and German tradition. Derived in which way? That means they have written, that means Western literature, they have written their writings. The story is borrowed from Greco-Roman folk tales, Christian stories, or religious stories, or other stories. And same thing will be happening in English literature. They borrowed many of their stories from the French and German tradition. Now, French and German have been their individual identity. So what will be the status of English and Western literature? So Majumdar put it that Western and English do not have their national literature in the truest sense of term. Why? Because they have borrowed their story from Greco-Roman tradition and also from French and German tradition. On the contrary, Western and English literature can be called sub-national literature. Yeah. So Majumdar wanted to say that English and the Western literature, they have borrowed their story from the Greco-Roman tradition and the French and German tradition. So this literature cannot be called the national literature. This literature can be defined as the sub-national literature. So a new genre came in discussion of comparative literature, that is the sub-national literature. Thus, Majumdar quite clearly brings comparative literature to a radically alternative and a revolutionary discourse of national literature. So comparative literature comes in collide with national literature. Before Majumdar's comment, national literature didn't come up to this margin. This was not valued so importantly. When Majumdar says that English literature and the Western literature can be called sub-national literature, it indirectly indicates that there might have a national literature. In this chapter, while West makes the division of great literature as well as majority and minority literature, Majumdar articulates comparative literature as an action of comparing between national and sub-national literature. Okay, so Western critics were busy in comparing majority and minority literature, in which sense the majority literature will be the literature of Europe and the minority literature will be the literature of India, Africa, China, Brazil, Japan, etc. And also they will be calling two different, the great literature, the European literature are the great literature, and the literature from other parts can be called cannot be called great literature. Majumdar put that yes, comparative literature will be comparing from this day onwards between national literature and sub-national literature. Fine. So in Majumdar's speech, it has been clear that subnational literature, West European and English literature lost their identity a bit, and the discourse of national literature gets refueled and reinforced. So Majumdar's remark made national literature an important field of literature, except the European definition of great literature, world literature, majority literature, or minority literature. So national literature gets a new entity in the horizon of literature. Another critic, Bhumi K. Bhava, you have heard his name, echoes a quite similar attitude by his new emphasis on post-colonial literature. Bhumi K. Bhava suggests that cross-references can be termed as cross-cutting of the social significance, which undermines the diverse cultural and ethnic relevances. So, you know, Bhumi K. Bhava is a famous critic based on post-colonial studies. And in terms of post-colonial identity, Bhumi K. Bhava put a point that cross-reference, that means cross-reference, referencing from within the indigenous literature and the outside literature is a cross-cutting. And whenever the cross-cutting will be done, indirectly it will undermine the significance of diverse, or the varied cultural and ethnic existence and relevances of the world. It's a very good point mentioned by Komike Baba. And that issue also refuels the significance of national culture, and it also gives weightage to the other ethnic and cultural as well as the literary identity. In such a way, development of comparative literature beyond Europe and North America clears all kinds of assumption and confusion which were created for the discourse of Eurocentric literature. So this is the field, comparative literature, for the flourishment of comparative literature. Eurocentric notion of superiority in terms of literature got faith in the truest sense of term, and also uh, apart from European and North American literature, we see the famous literature started to come in discussion from the other parts of this world. So Eurocentric norms of superiority in literature got failed for the flourishment of comparative literature gradually. Ole Soyinka and the whole range of African critic. So here, another critic who have come, that is Ole Soyinka. You most probably you have heard his name. So Ole Soyinka and a whole range of African critics brought light to the extensive influence and comment of German philosopher Friedrich Hegel. So Ole Soyinka quote Hegel, the German philosopher. He argued, Hegel argued that African culture is weak in contrast to higher or more developed culture. So German philosopher Friedrich Hegel commented that the African lit culture as a whole is weak in comparison to the more developed culture. It meant the European culture or American culture. This means Hegel denied the standard African history and culture in his comment. Ole Soyinka put that comment that that decision cannot be granted, that the African culture is not a standard one. Next time, another Canadian anthropologist, James Sneed, attacking Hegel's point, and James Sneed comes up with another important point relating to comparative literature. James Sneed said that the fact of late 20th century European culture is its ongoing reconciliation with Black culture. So James Sneed's point that in Europe and in America, uh, there was a mixture of the culture, because at that period, lots of immigrant people were moving towards European countries, and they came from different reasons. Some went there for immigration, some went there for working, some went there for several reasons. So the Black people in European countries got a significant number in the citizen or in the countries. So their European culture had in collide with the Black culture. So what would be the exact European culture that should be defined? And this situation is mentioned by James Sneed. And the separation between cultures was perhaps all along not one of nature, but one of force. So James Sneed here put his comment, then we separate people according to culture. Actually, uh, it is not by choice, it is not by nature, that is naturally the people will be changing the culture. So there is another part that people will be accepting others' culture. That is called assimilation. That means the immigrant people will be accepting the country's other countries' culture. That is assimilation. But the original culture cannot be forgotten and cannot be wiped out from an ethnic group. And keeping it in mind, James Smith said that the cultural separation is a matter that cannot be done naturally. It is actually done by force. Thus, the picture of comparative literary studies changes according to the places where it is taking place. So the scenario, comparative literary study, what we'll be comparing, most probably you have, you can remember the question we put in our first question, what sort of thing we will be comparing in comparative literature. So gradually, the field of comparative literature is getting so many things to compare. And in this way, James Smith said, that means comparative literary study will be determined according to the places where it is taking place. That means comparative studies in North America will be comparing different scenarios, and as well as comparative literature in Europe, Africa, and Asia will be comparing in different perspectives, especially the place, the location where we will be applying comparative literature. That's very important. And in African, Indian, Caribbean cities have challenged the refusal of Western literary criticism. And such kind of refusal attitude, especially done by Hegel, that was challenged by Indian, African, and Caribbean cities critics, and to accept the implication of their literary and cultural policy. So this is challenged by the other parts, especially Africa, India. British literary theorist and critic Terry Eagleton comes up with his argument, and he said that literature is an inherited word which means an ideology. So literature can be compared with a showroom of an ethnic group or of a established linguistics group or of a established race. And in literature, we will see the ideology of that special group or ethnic people. Ethnic people in literature, we can see that. So to Terry Eagleton's comment, the emergence of English as an academic subject in the 19th century had a quite clear political implication. You know that in the 19th century, English or the Britain got supreme in power economically, technologically, and politically as well. So the establishment of the English subject at universities was the result of vast social changes brought about in the aftermath of the First World War. So Terry Eagleton, this British critic, commented that the English as a subject at universities brought not for the love to other reason, but after the First World War, Englishmen became powerful politically, economically, and technologically. And for this powerful reason, for this power, English subject is included or was included at many universities of this world. That is commented by British critic Terry Eagleton. So the Great War, that means the First World War, causes chauvinism. Chauvinism, you know, that exaggerated or aggressive patriotism. which also creates a ruling class rhetoric. That means a literature of ruling class, the culture of ruling class, the likings and disliking of ruling class. Such likings and disliking came in literature after the First World War, because after the First World War, many countries started to pinpoint their national identity and heritage. So everyone became much more aggressive patriotic person after the First World War. And for this reason, that situation created. So situation created, that means the social group created, that means the ruling class and the person who are ruled by the ruling class people. So this social division created very vehemently, very significantly after the First World War. English literature rode on power after the First World War as the literature of wartime nationalism. With literature, Englishmen could regroup both to explore and to find some alternatives to the nightmare of the history after the First World War. Actually, in the First World War, we have seen massacre, the world civilizations, they have observed a massacre, the Holocaust, several killings, several countries were burned to ashes. And for this reason, in order to reconcile this situation, Englishmen try to impose their literature to present their more good notion of nationalism towards the other countries who were ruled by the Englishmen or the English ruling class or the superior ruling class. So English literature became a thing that Englishmen try to minimize the gap between two cultures in one explanation, according to one explanation. So this comment, Eagleton's explanation, connects the aspiration of the early comparatists who tried to transcend or overcome the cultural boundaries and to unite the human race through the civilizing power of great literature. So at the very initial stage of this course, we have been discussing, that means great literature is a way we can connect the reach of world civilization, or we can connect the human being living in every part of this world. So here, Terry Eagleton's comment refuels that attitude that in order to transcend or overcome the cultural boundaries, literature can be an weapon. With the literature, we can unite the human race of all over the world. But English literature was itself in a crisis of identity that is imposed a little bit earlier. We have said that English literature has borrowed many history from the German and French tradition, from the German and French folktales and other culture. So English literature was itself in a crisis of identity. So how this situation will be erased? Which one will be calling English literature? So a question comes in the mind of the critic, especially whenever they will be comparing literature, because at the initial stage, we were in a position that we will be comparing literature of two languages. We will be comparing the literature of two cultures, two countries, etc. So which one? We will be calling English literature as well. That's fine. Let's come to the definition. Literature produced within the geographical location of England or of the United Kingdom. You know that England, UK, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland. These four countries are there in United Kingdom. So literature, we see literature both in Ireland, both in Scotland, both in Wales, and both in England. So which one will be calling the English literature? Where does the boundary line of literature lie? Is there a boundary of literature? Where does the boundary line of the popular and mass culture, popular culture and the mass culture lie? So this question comes in discussion. Once upon a time, English meant Beowulf. Beowulf, that means the old English poetry Beowulf. And the Beowulf is the longest poem composed in English. So once upon a time, Beowulf, a text of Virginia Woolf, they claimed, meant that day has gone. But now, Beowulf is a text in English translation, but it is studied at we don't know the name of the writings. Beowulf. It is written by an anonymous writer. So Beowulf is not cannot be called a part of English literature. Who wrote Beowulf? Thus, what to include and exclude from English literature syllabus? That also come in discussion. Keeping the answers of all these questions, comparative literature can be termed as the emergence of an alternative schools of thought. So, when such kind of questions comes in the mind of the scholars, then comparative literature can be called an alternative school of thought. This definition can be appropriate to comparative literature because the critic are attacking comparative literature that it cannot be a discipline. What it will be comparing is comparison may be the subject of a discipline? Such kind of severe question were asked in against comparative literature. So here we can say that comparative literature can be an alternative school of thought. In such a juncture, Palestine-born American scholar Edward Said comes in. And Said pioneered the notion of Orientalism. And Said said that the word Orient achieved a wide range or field of meanings, associations, and connotations, which didn't refer to the real Orient, but refer to the fields surrounding the word. Actually, Orient, day by day, getting so many associations. Once upon a time, Occident and Orient, Western and Eastern. In such a way, Orient had been accepted. But from the time onwards, Orient is getting association with so many meanings. So we see Oriental literature, and then we study post-colonial literature, colonial literature. Again, we see cultural literature or cultural studies. So Orient itself is not a word only to mean the Eastern or the other parts of Western. It has now many explanations. And this comment is done by Edward Said. Another critic comes up. Chinese scholar Zhang Lungxi's book, and he has written a book. The name of that book is The Myth of the Other, China in the Eyes of the West. This is the title of his book. And in this book, Zhang Lungxi commented that for the West, China is a land in the Far East, becomes traditionally the image of the ultimate others. You know, the explanation of others. Others mean the European and the Western are in one side, and apart from the European and Western, the people living in the other parts, they are called the others. That means other in culture, of course, less important or weak culture, other in civilization or other aspects of knowledge, of course, less important scenario. So this other is a term that is imposed by the European colonial power or the superior colonial power to underestimate the historical, ethnic, and other values of the country except Europe and Western people or Western countries. And such notion of otherness is challenged by the non-European critic. Non-European critic at this juncture said that yes, we have a different culture, we have a different language, we have a different literature, but who will make the parameter of understanding the cultural or linguistic or literary weights? Who will uh, make the parameter that which literature will be called the best literature? Is it European literature or is it African literature? So from the perspectives, there is no other. All literature, that means literature in Brazil, literature in Congo, literature in Africa as a whole, literature in Asia, every literature are equal. Every literature is equal in weights. So this idea of otherness had been challenged by the non-European critics. They say, that means the non-European critics say that these colonizing notions are systematically inventing the other cultural studies on the agenda of literary studies. So what I have said and what the non-European critic put, whenever they put that we have our culture, we have our language, and we have our literature. So whatever it is in the position, it is our culture. This notion and this colonizing notions invite that the African culture, African literature, Brazil culture, Brazil literature has put in syllabus at universities to study. In this ways, studies of the other culture, in this way, studies of the other cultural studies or the cultural studies becomes the part of comparative literature. So comparative literature gets another field to compare. That is, uh, uh, comparing literature will not only be comparing the literature of two languages or two countries or two ethnic groups, but from this time onwards, comparative literature will also be comparing two different cultures. And then this definition, that is comparative literature is interdisciplinary, that definition gets granted, that comparative literature is a genre that can compare two different fields of literature, two different fields of culture, two different fields of language, two different things that is noticeable and that is researchable by the researcher. Here, another example I can put, and I will finish my lecture with that example today, inshallah. The syllabus of European and non-European, North American literature concerns an established canon of great literature. But the syllabus of non-European culture underwent a period of colonization by the Western power. So they can easily, the European and North American syllabus, they can put all of their great literature in syllabus. But whenever we will be putting some literature in our syllabus, that means colonial, post-colonial literature or African literature or the Asian literature as a whole, that decision also went under the colonizing powers supervision. For example, we will understand that Shakespeare is a canonical writer hailed in the 19th century as an epitome of English greatness. So we see that literature is great literature. It is obviously right all over the world that William Shakespeare is a very great writer. But what happens to Shakespeare reading in India? This very Shakespeare in India has been accepted in two different angles or perspectives. Indian students see Shakespeare as a great figure in European literature in one hand, as well as a representative of colonial values. So reading Shakespeare in India in two different perspectives. In one time, it is William Shakespeare is a great writer, and at the same time, through William Shakespeare writings and readings, we can understand the colonial values. What are the colonial values? So such kind of two readings of Shakespeare can also be a part of comparative literature. So two conflicting images of Shakespeare can be studied in comparative literature, and comparative literature gets a period of crisis in the West. But for the growth of national consciousness and the awareness, many nations need to move beyond the colonial legacy. It means that after the colonial period, many countries started to think about their national heritage, their national identity. And for this reason, they want to overcome the boundary that their identity has been, that means colonial countries' identity has been determined by the colonial power. So their identity is not the real identity, because this identity they have got from the colonial legacy. Such kind of identity the colonial countries wanted to overcome. And that attitude developed the study of comparative literature significantly in many countries like China, Brazil, India, and many African nations. They want to understand their true identity, the national consciousness they want to uh, insert. And these countries started differentiating indigenous tradition and imported or imposed tradition. And these countries in a position that which portion of their culture is original and which portion of their culture is imported or imposed or superimposed. They wanted to differentiate these two types of culture within a country. And thus, comparative literature gets a very clear notion of which to compare. That is, in which way, and which are the subject of comparison in comparative literature. In India, Ganesh Devi's remarks is coincided with the rise of modern Indian nationalism. Another critique, Ganesh Devi, serves to remind us the origin of the term comparative literature in Europe. So here, we can go the initial stage of the term, that is comparative literature. Here, he said that comparative literature, the term, appeared in Europe as the result of national struggles. So when the national struggle started in Europe, at the very juncture, the people, the countries of Europe, they started to put new boundaries. They started to put the national culture. They started to insert their national identities all over the Europe. And when such national struggle and culture was started vehemently all over the Europe at the very juncture, and not only that, such kind of national consciousness was started. Such kind of uh, national consciousness also started in the many expanding portion of United States of America. So in United States of America, in Europe, the people They were trying to insert their national identity. They are trying to start their national boundaries. And at such a juncture, the term comparative literature has been started in Europe. So comparative literature is interdisciplinary. And from the time onwards, this field, comparative literature, is getting so many fields to compare. It's getting so many ideas to compare. So nowadays, national literature and imported literature, even by giving an examples, we have made it clear that even William Shakespeare reading in India can be a field of comparative literature. Even William Shakespeare reading in Bangladesh can be a field of comparative literature. So comparative literature is a interdisciplinary field where we can compare many subfields, or not subfields. We can compare many things like culture, language, literature, anthropology, and even some other fields of uh, arts and culture. So thank you very much for attending the class.